This session is titled Catastrophe Resilience, and it features Christopher Mcdaniel, President of the Catastrophe Resiliency Council. Originally delivered to a live audience of both on-site and webinar participants, this session originated from the campus of Illinois State University. It's a collaborative effort of the Institute's Griffith Insurance Education Foundation, the Insurance Regulator Education Foundation, and the Cady School of Insurance at Illinois State. In keeping with the respective missions of these organizations, this session is purely instructional in nature and does not support a position on any issues.
Thank you guys for being here today. My name is Christopher Mcdaniel. I am the president of the Catastrophe Resiliency Council, and I will tell you more about what we're doing in specifics first. But the first thing I wanted to do was to kind of give you a snapshot, if you will, of where we are from a catastrophe landscape. And then we'll get into some of the specifics around what the industry is doing around resiliency. So, what is the catastrophe landscape like right now? And I apologize, this text is a little bit smaller than what I thought it was going to be. But basically, this is a graph that shows from 2019 to 2021 in various different categories here. So you have large storms, you have, I have to step back myself to be able to read it. You have earthquakes, you have other things on here. I'm sorry, I can't even read it myself. It's so small. Apologize for that. But so this is the number of catastrophes that are occurring in these. So this is severe storms. This is wildfires. This is and we have our earthquakes and stuff. Data you can't read either, but the point that I wanted to make between 2019 and 2021 is in the severe storms category, the increase between 2019 and 2021 is has gone up by 23%. In our next category, it has gone up by 36%, 25%, and then interestingly, in our winter storms, which is this category here, is actually gone down by 300%. So that's very much tied to when the actual number of winter storms that have occurred. But keep this number in mind, this negative 300%, because you're going to see something interesting that happens with that in just a moment. And earthquakes is so small that, pardon the pun, it barely even registers. And then your tropical storms are also minus 67%. So your tropical storms and your winter storms went down fairly dramatically. But you're going to see something interesting because, again, this is the number of storms that are out there, and this is the losses associated from these various catastrophes. So now let's look at the losses and the percentage change on the losses. So here with our tropical cyclones again. 95%, tropical cyclones over here, minus 67%. So the volume of tropical storms went lower between 2019 and 2021, but yet the losses were 95% higher. So what does that tell us? That tells us that the tropical storms are getting more fierce and they're getting stronger. And the losses themselves are higher, even though the volume of storms was lower. 70% on our winter storms. Again, the loss is 70% higher between 2019 and 2021. 94% on our wildfire, which has gone up significantly as well. And in our thunderstorms, 28%. So you can see across the board, even though in some of these categories, it varies between 2019 and 2021, whether it was a positive increase or negative as far as actual occurrences. But in all cases, it's gone up as far as the losses go. So things are getting worse. Now, that's not, a plug for clients should believe in climate risk and that kind of thing, although I think the majority of folks do at this point. 3 years is not a trend, but it does give you an indication that, again, the costs are rising, the costs are getting higher. So, again, apologize for the smallness of the text there, but I wanted to give you guys a snapshot before I started talking about what the industry is actually doing from a resiliency standpoint. So, Catastrophe Resiliency Council, who are we? We're a nonprofit organization, and the second bullet is really important. We are focused internally on the industry. So when it comes to climate risk and catastrophes and things of that nature, we're not looking at carbon credits and things of that nature. That's not anything that we're doing. We're looking at the industry itself and where are there potential cracks in the industry as far as the existing catastrophes that could be exacerbated based on climate risk, and fixing those cracks in the industry. And we'll talk more in detail about some of those cracks in a minute. We don't make the standards, we make them better. We work with a lot of different organizations to implement these solutions to try to fix the cracks in the industry. But we are not a standalone organization. We're a facilitator. We get out there and we pull people together, we pull organizations together to make things happen for the industry. And lastly, we try to be the voice of the industry as well, talking with you guys. We're doing some other things in the regulatory space as far as creating some white papers, looking at potentially doing some training for the regulatory space, a lot of different things so that we're the voice of the industry that we can share and make you guys aware of what we're actually doing in that space. So this next slide talks about who are the participants in our organization. We're a very unique organization. We're also an affiliate of the Institute, and a lot of the affiliates of the institutes that are membership organizations only allow carriers, brokers, and reinsurers to be members. We're different. We include the carriers, brokers, reinsurers as well, but we also include the risk analytics organizations. If you're not familiar with the companies out there that are the big players in this space, there's really 3 big ones. There's a number of small ones, but 3 big ones. Number one largest market share is a company called RMS. Then you also have a company called CoreLogic, and you have a company called Verisk that have a little bit smaller portions. But those 3 companies by far are providing most of the CAT models that carriers, brokers, reinsurers have out there and are using in their organization. So it's very important for the kind of work that we're doing to have them at the table as members as well. In addition, we have other associate members, other associations, academia, other consortia, regulators, you guys potentially, governments, and collaborators, which are like legal entities, banks, energy companies, others, and also consultants, software devs, platforms, TPAs, startups, and insurtechs. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing with some of these organizations as we get further in the presentation. So this is our strategy roadmap. And these first 2 circles, the blue and the green here, I'm going to do a deep dive on those in just a minute and talk to you about what we're doing there in the open data and the fidelity standpoint. The blue is open data, the green is the fidelity. So let's hold on that. I'll talk about that in the upcoming slides. But some of the other things that we have on a roadmap that we're looking to do is an open industry exposure database. This is something that a lot of proprietary standalone exposure databases are out there right now, but there's not one that's an open standard where regulators can go in and look at the open exposure, brokers, reinsurers, et cetera. Everybody can use the same data and everybody feeds data. There's no one source right now for open exposure. So that's something that we're looking to do. Another one that is really interesting, and you would think that this would be something that would already be in place, but contract description standards. For all the contracts between carrier brokers and reinsurers, there's no common language between them. So they go through this translation effort every time in their contract, and maybe it means one thing to one company, something else to another. So getting a common language seems like a basic thing, but it's something that a ton of time is spent on in the industry. So we're looking to yet a common language that everybody can use the same terms and everything associated with it. Climate research in general, obviously, there's a lot of that going on across the industry. A lot of new things happening there. A lot of really interesting things that are happening as well. And moving that forward is one of our goals. New products research. There's a lot of really interesting things going. We were talking at dinner last night. Most of you probably heard the term InsurTech before. We coined a new term called CAT Tech, which is for catastrophe technology. And there's a lot of really interesting products that are out there. I'll highlight one or two of those a little bit later on in the presentation that I think are particularly interesting. But things are moving very, very quickly, especially in the last few years from a new product standpoint. Mitigation and planning. Again, everybody's doing that in the industry right now is doing that from a silo basis. There's no coming together of organizations. You'll kind of hear that as a theme across the different things that I'll share with you. Is people don't talk to each other as much as they should. They're not sharing information between these big companies. Everybody's proprietary. Everybody thinks how they do it is secret sauce, and nobody does it better than them. Quite honestly, most of them are doing the same thing, the same way for the most part, but none of them believe they are. They all think what they're doing is special, so that creates an atmosphere that makes it very hard to get them to share and come together and talk to each other, which is, again, from a facilitation standpoint, one of the key reasons that CRC is in place is to try to get all of those folks in the room, get them talking to each other and working for common solutions. Claims development. A lot of things around the claim space. We'll talk more about that a little bit. Capital chain resilience. That's another interesting one too. One of the things that I tell people, and again, it's a little bit of a play on words here, but climate risk is kind of like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. Same thing here. There needs to be some real long-term plans put in place on how the industry is going to be resilient. So I talk to a lot of these folks, carrier brokers, reinsurers on a daily basis, and you talk to them about climate risk, and their answer is, oh, from a solvency standpoint, we're cool, we got it covered. And I'm like, well, the entire state of California catches on fire, and you have to cover, are you really going to cover the entire state of California? A tidal wave hitting New York, whatever, happen to happen from a climate risk standpoint, sea levels rising and half of Florida's underwater. Are you really covered for that kind of stuff? So I think it's a little bit of a false sense that they're ready for it, and reality, unfortunately, is going to be different if it's severe as it appears like it's going to be long term. So one of the things that we are really pushing for is to create a plan for what's it going to be like 20, 30, 50 years down the road. How are we going to ensure that the industry is going to actually be resilient and can survive things if they go to that scale? Hopefully we'll be able to thwart many of those things and it won't go to that scale, but if it does, we have to make sure that the industry is prepared. So let me do a little bit of a deep dive on those first two bubbles that I talked about there. One being data standards and fidelity. They, again, under the same theme of no one talking to each other at the level that they need to be in the industry. One of the interesting things that's happened, and this is what happens when things evolve over time that are being planned, is that those three companies that I mentioned, RMS, CoreLogic, and Verisk, have created catastrophe models. Well, those are all for-profit companies, and they all share their CAT models with each other. They consider those proprietary. They go out and sell those CAT models to every single insurer, broker, and reinsurer out there. So everybody out there has one of those three models, which don't talk to each other. And then you have a situation where these models have been customized by each individual company. So, they've taken, three disparate models anyway, and they customize them even more and use fills maybe for things that are not what the proper purpose and that kind of thing. So what you wind up with is quite a mess from a model standpoint. It might work for that particular company internally, but when it comes time to share information between those companies, you got a tower of Babel because nobody's speaking the same language. Everybody's talking a different language. So these CAT models are created, and you have the situation where, pre-catastrophe they're sharing the model information between the carriers, brokers, reinsurers, as they're getting everything in place for their treaties and whatnot, and making sure they're insured. And every time that CAT data is shared between two entities, there's a whole army of people at the insurers, brokers, and reinsurers that are sitting down and having to go, okay, that field maps to this field maps to that field maps to nothing. And it's just a waste, a big, huge waste of time in translating between those customized vendor models, and it happens every single time. So if the carrier has to share information with the broker then has to share it with the reinsurer. If they go back and forth before they get to whatever their deal is, every time it passes between the two of them, it has to be retranslated over again. And what you wind up with is basically, the analogy of a copy machine. Every time you make a copy of a copy, you lose some of the fidelity. It gets darker and darker, more blurry, whatsoever. And at the end of the day, when you've gone back and forth with these models a number of times, the data gets to be basically unusable. So now you're making decisions off data that is questionable at best. That's before a catastrophe happens, that they're doing all that, when they're trying to get all the contracts and everything in place. It is even worse after a catastrophe, because then you've got the pressure and the time element that comes into play, where they're trying to share data back and forth, and mistakes get made in the translations, everything else, and it is really just amplified even more, the loss of data that happens. So that's the state of the situation in the industry pre what CRC has facilitated. And what we have facilitated is, for lack of a better term, a universal translator that can take the data from the individual insurer, broker, or reinsurer, can take that data and through a tool, convert that data into a standard format that everybody can read without any loss of fidelity. So you're not doing the copy machine over and over and over again. So what we use for that is, there's a tool created by the IDF. If you're familiar with ETL tools, maybe extract, transfer, load is a pretty common terminology, but it's basically just taking data, converting it, transforming it, sending it back out again. So the IDF, the Insurance Development Forum, is part of the World Bank, and they are the ones that built the tool to actually do that translation. And then the format that we're changing it into is a format by an organization called OASIS. And OASIS is important because they have an open standards CAT model and a framework for creating other CAT models down the road, right now specifically on property. But the interesting thing about that is that they are a nonprofit. Remember I said that the 3 vendors that are out there that don't like to talk to each other, won't share data, everything's proprietary? Not the case with OASIS, because theirs is an open standard. So they're Switzerland, and all of that data that's proprietary or customized or whatever can be converted into their standard, and then that's a standard that everyone can use. So that's something that we've been working on for about a year now, and we've done testing now with 7 firms within the industry, and the hope is over the course of the next 12 months that we'll get most of the other big, large organizations also to test. We're going to also ultimately give them a stamp of approval. So if they do the proper testing with us, and we can say that they can translate the data in both directions without loss of fidelity, then they'll get a stamp of approval, which then the other firms can look at and say, oh, okay, I can trust their format Therefore, I can utilize their OASIS format data and not lose any fidelity. Sounds like a small thing, but when you think of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that do all that manual translation and all that fidelity loss, it's a big thing in the industry. And it's interesting because you tell people about something like this and like, oh, big deal, you're just converting a bunch of data models into other models. But to do that when you've got these vendor proprietary formats and then everything customizes, not a small feat. It's a fairly heavy lift for the companies to actually get their data, run it through, convert it, and get it out there on that standard. But it is a huge benefit to the industry. And it's a huge benefit for the industry now with the volume of catastrophes that we have now that you saw between 2019 2021. But think about it from the standpoint of how much that data needs to be shared from a climate risk standpoint. When you get there, and what we've got now times 100, it's going to be even more vital that everybody can talk to each other in the same language and knows tower of battle out there. That makes sense to everyone? So here are some of the other things that we're really focused on in the rest of this year and next year. We're continuing to do the thing around the open standards that I talked about. That's, again, now at the process of just setting up testing over and over again. If we find any issues or bugs or something that's not compatible, we're fixing them along the way, either in the IDF tool or in OASIS. But we're also facilitating that as well. InsurTech engagement is another one that we are doing. And as I mentioned, we recently coined that term, Cat Tech. We had at the RAA conference, which was a few weeks ago, the RAA Cat Modeling Conference, we hosted an open house where we brought in 5 or 6 of the most promising cat techs that are out there and allowed them basically to present to all of our board members and that kind of thing, get some exposure around what's out there. And there's some really, really interesting things out there. So, for example, one of the things that's going to be even more important is GIS data and being able to, being able to evaluate if this office building or this home or whatever, what the cat risk is down to that level. Well, a big problem up to this point is that you look at the data that's out there, and there's lots of data out there, but what you have is mailboxes. So, because it's based on the address. So it's not the actual building. Let's say that there's 5 buildings on the property. It's commercial. Each one could have a different cat model risk associated with it. But the problem is that the mailbox is where the little dot gets put on the map. Well, there's companies out there that have taken all the data that's out there, and they have basically used AI, and they can identify every single building on that property and put the dot right in the middle of that building. Again, it seems like a small thing, but it's huge for the industry because now when you can get it down to that granular level, you can do some other interesting things. So there's one company, well, there's multiple companies, but there's one in particular that has mapped every building in the United States. They've mapped every building in Australia, part of Europe, and they're working on Africa right now. So, really, really interesting stuff from that standpoint. The other thing, another one that is extremely interesting is that once you get down to that level where you can identify the individual buildings, we're moving beyond the basic policy type information and cat model type information that you would have on a particular building. So of course you want to know, is it in a flood zone and things like that. Those things obviously are very important, and all that kind of stuff is based in the models now. But there are companies out there that are taking the risk analysis to the next level. So what they're doing, for example, is one that's looking at risks like which power grid are you on? Are you on because where you're at, you're on the primary power grid because you're 2 blocks from the hospital, therefore you're less likely to lose power, and your company's a refrigeration company, so that makes a difference. You're on the secondary grid, well, your risk model's higher, so you should be getting higher costs associated with that for your insurance. It's that information that's beyond the basic information that you know that you normally get that now is starting to come in. And it's interesting because it really builds on it, because you couldn't, that information would be meaningless, again, if you can't plot down to the individual buildings and know which buildings that you're talking about. So it all kind of builds on each other and really goes into what we're hoping to ultimately build in this open industry exposure database that we're looking at creating. Now, this is not built yet, but we're looking to do something that, number one, is open, so that everyone can utilize the open exposure data that's out there, whether it's regulators or companies or whatever, but to pull in all that data from all these cat tags. So, you know, the pinpointing of the building, this extra information beyond what is normally gathered from a, from an underwriting standpoint, to be able to have that data in this open industry exposure. And quite honestly, we're looking at potentially putting all that information on a blockchain. So it basically becomes a register for all buildings in the United States, with all this detailed data that we're talking about, in addition to the kind of data that we currently gather. So very interesting from that standpoint. Climate change impact assessment. We're doing a lot from a stakeholder education standpoint. One of the things that we're working on right now is we have a white paper that's hopefully going to be out by the end of June. That is the state of resiliency currently. So it's a snapshot of the current situation in the industry. Hopefully that'll be out by the end of June. That's what we're shooting for. Might go into July. And then after we finish that, we're going to start another white paper, and it's going to be, what do we need to be resilient 20 years, 30 years, 50 years out? Because frankly, that's the, when the climate risk is going to hit. And, a lot of the regulators, a lot of you guys are asking things like, well, what is your portfolio going to look like in 15 years? How are you going to protect that? And quite honestly, the industry's answer is, I don't know. We're going to help to get the industry there and actually have an answer for you, and have something that you can refer to that says, oh, here's a white paper that details it out in the next 20, 30, 50 years. So that's something that's going to be coming. Some other interesting things that we're doing is looking at as well is something that we're calling open event footprints. And you'll kind of see a trend here, with the different data risk folks at the three companies I mentioned before. But those are the same guys that, after a hurricane, put out the wind field information that all the companies use. The problem is that they all want to make sure it syncs up to their proprietary models that they have. So sometimes it takes as much as, after a hurricane, it takes as much as 6 months to a year to get the final data from those three model vendors on the wind fields after something like a hurricane. Well, obviously that's a problem, because the insurers can't wait 6 months to a year to pay claims, but they can't get accurate wind field information. So it's a big source of trouble for the industry, because they have to look backwards instead of looking forward to the actual data that actually occurred, to be able to determine how they should pay claims and whatnot. So that's a big challenge for them. So one of the things that we've been asked to do is something that we're calling, again, footprints. And what it is instead of trying to make the data perfect when it comes out of the gate, instead what we'll do is we'll create an iterative process. So within 48 hours, we'll put out some data. It won't be perfect, but then it'll be iterative, and it'll get updated over the course of multiple months until it gets to that point. Not perfect, but again, it gives the industry, it gives the carriers at least something to go on, so that they don't have to wait 6 months to a year to find out if what they actually paid out was appropriate or not. So big factor there. So these three things in blue are what we call tactical items. Those are things that are in play right now. Both of these, the open exposure database and the open event footprints, both require building something and maintaining something ongoing. So they're much larger efforts, but the goal is to have those both begin in the latter part of this year. So 2023 and beyond, again, our tool build, our certifications on our standards, our voice of the industry, those things, of course, will continue. The things that you saw earlier here are the, on our roadmap, are the things that are going to be further out. So the previous slides, things that we're working on the next 12 to 18 months. These items are the ones that we're going to be looking at further out, that we talked about earlier. Contract standards is a big one here. That one is something we're going to be looking at a lot. And we're hoping that out of these white papers that we're creating, that we'll really be able to create some very strong resilience education and message out there, and define a plan of how to go forward with making the industry resilient 20, 30, 50 years out, and not just right now.
The Institute's Griffith Insurance Education Foundation, the Insurance Regulator Education Foundation, and the Cady School of Insurance at Illinois State University were pleased to collaborate on this session. We thank Christopher Mcdaniel for sharing his expertise. To learn more about Griffith Foundation programming, please visit www.griffithfoundation.org.